Hello, it's Tuesday, September the 4th. This is The Drill. Thank you. I am Ron, your host, the only host that is a true conservative, and I am a true conservative because I make the presumption for the status quo, and am the only conservative in the United States of America who does so. So, along the lines of what is true conservatism, and how does it differ from what I refer to as false conservative or faux conservatism, is pragmatism. A true conservative is not pragmatic. A true conservative is principled, makes decisions based on principles, makes political decisions based on principle, makes personal decisions based on principles, on concepts and abstractions. And pragmatism is a so-called American philosophy that was created by three Americans over 100 years ago. I can't remember their names right now, but they came up with this idea. But basically what they did is they took the adage that might makes right, and they just dressed it up like the dog's dinner and said that the consequences are the issue. Okay, that all ideas, whether good or bad, should be judged by their consequences, which is just a fancy way of saying the ends justify the means. And it's crap. Classic example of that is in Nazi Germany. A lot of Jews and other people that were incarcerated in concentration camps were used for medical experiments. And some of those medical experiments have proven fruitful in that they have provided medical knowledge for subsequent experiments, and they have perhaps provided, in some cases, new medical treatments, therapies, and very possibly cures for medical diseases and whatnot. Does that mean that the Nazis that conducted these experiments should be a mitigating circumstance in terms of punishment, and or should this be something that's considered when we're looking at the innocence or guilt of those Nazis when they're conducting these experiments? And the answer is no, absolutely not. That they committed a crime. They forced Jews and others to be part of these experiments, whether they liked it or not, under the threat of death, penalty of death, and made them forced them to be unwitting participants, or not unwitting, but unwilling participants in these experiments. And for that, they should be prosecuted, tried, if found guilty, then they should be receiving an extremely harsh punishment. There are those that want to make the issue complicated and say, well, should we even use the information, any of the information that was generated by the Nazis in these experiments? And I say, of course you do, because that's not the issue. The issue is, are the Nazis to be exonerated in any way, shape, or form for the work they did simply because it added to the sum total of medical knowledge and perhaps benefited humankind in some way, shape, or form? And the answer to that one is obviously no. So again, because wrong is wrong. You don't force people against their will to submit to medical experiments. The individual, and that's part of the reason that the Nazis did this and felt comfortable, is that their concept of individuality is a whole lot different than the American concept of individuality, whereas here and in reality, the individual is sacrosanct. You do nothing to force the state does nothing to force the individual to do anything. The state is in the business of protecting the individual and protecting the rights of the individual. with the Nazis, and with the socialists for that matter, the individual is merely a tool of the state, and the interests and needs of the individual are subordinate to the needs and the wants of the state. It's almost like being, and as a matter of fact, everybody in Germany was militarized to one degree or another. But I was going to say it's almost like being in the military. When I was in the Air Force, we were always told Air Force needs come first. But there's a limit to that. That means that if the Air Force needed me to go leave one particular base and go to another, then that's what I've got to do. I don't have a veto over that the way I would in civilian life. But that's a temporary situation. It's only for as long as you serve. And then when you go back to being a civilian, you go back to being having your individuality respected, and that is foremost. And the reason it is because there really is no such thing as group rights. There's no such thing as men's rights. There's no such thing as white rights. There is no such thing as animal rights. Okay, there's no group rights. There's only rights, the rights of the individual, no matter who that individual happens to be. We all, as individuals, have the same rights, whether you're a man, a woman, whether you're gay or straight, whether or you're black, white, Hispanic, Asian. Each of us as individuals have rights, and at least some of them have been enunciated or marked down in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So, anyways, that's the point, is that if you're a true conservative, you're looking at things from the standpoint of principle, and you're not looking at it from the standpoint of pragmatism. Pragmatism also has a tendency to lend itself to materialism, to the idea that the material goods supersede non-material or conceptual or abstract ideas. The left likes to say, what good is freedom if you don't have any food? To which I respond, what is the point of eating or living or surviving if you have no dignity? Yeah, if you have no freedom and therefore dignity, and can't assert the direction of your own life. So that is, at least at times, if not always, more important. The abstract, the conceptual are more important than the material, and or at least as important. But the left wants to make it out as though concepts and abstractions are just basically that they're tools of the capitalists to keep everybody oppressed, keep everybody arguing and whatnot, and keep everybody oppressed. And it's just it's BS. The concepts and abstractions are as real as things that are material, as the things that you can touch and feel. So freedom is just as real as a cheeseburger, and justice and prudence and temperance and on and on and on. So with all the different concepts, reality, if you want to get really fundamental about it, reality, certainty, morality, and beauty, all concepts, all actually abstractions, and all just as real as anything you choose to eat. So today I'm going to be reading from the two Playboy interviews, one that deals with, that is an interview of, I should say, Bill O'Reilly, talk show host, formerly on Fox News, and a 1964 interview of Ayn Rand. So when we come back, a little bit of Bill O'Reilly. Okay, thank you very much. And I like to read some of the interviews because, again, it shows the tactics of the left, the psychologistic tactics of the left, and that if you're not careful, you'll find yourself in a bit of a box and in a bit of a bind, and find yourself very difficult to win an argument. I've always said that if you find yourself in a position where you know that you're right, but you feel like you're losing the argument, something is rotten in Denmark, and it's not the cheese. So it means that you've been tricked. Somewhere, somehow, you've been tricked. And you got to find out where you've been tricked and try to regain the upper hand. In some cases, you may need to just shut the argument down in its entirety. You know what? It seems like you're making a decent point. Let me think about it and I'll get back to you. Something of that nature. But in any case, so what we're doing here with Bill O'Reilly, and a lot of it is interesting. Again, this is the dynamic here is left-right. Playboy's left, Bill O'Reilly, Ayn Rand. Well, Ayn Rand, not so much right, but as far as Playboy is concerned, I guess so. But Bill O'Reilly definitely on the right of the political spectrum as compared to Playboy. So there's some interesting dynamics that occur. Most of the time with Playboy, they've been pretty good. A lot of times that what the secret is with interviewers is that they'll try to turn the interview from an interview into an interrogation, a deposition, something of that nature. And they usually do it by asking leading questions. So they try to lead you in a particular direction or try to get you to prove negatives, things of that nature. In this interview so far with Bill O'Reilly, they've been pretty straightforward. They've asked positive questions. What do you think about this? How do you feel about that? Kind of questions. And so one of the things that we've gotten to here is Bill O'Reilly was talking about his the way he treats people that come on his show and how he has handled various political figures and whatnot. So now we're going to get to some sexual issues, I guess, is the way to put it. So here's it from the interview. Playboy, you have taken on gay activists. You famously said, "Dykes on bikes, take a hike." O'Reilly, the point is, when is the gay community in the U.S. going to figure it out that they're never going to be accepted by most Americans? That is, most Americans are never going to embrace their lifestyle, if for no other reason than religion. At the same time, most Americans don't want to see anything bad happen to gay people. Playboy, there are some notable exceptions, particularly on the religious right. O'Reilly, I'm talking most Americans, not idiots, but why must you discuss your sex life? Whether you're gay or straight, nothing good can come of that. Playboy, is it fair to summarize your view as don't ask, don't tell? Not just in the military, but also in life. O'Reilly, absolutely. Shut up. It's nobody's business, straight or gay. If a straight woman is sleeping with 18 guys and thinks she can go out and tell everybody and not pay a price, she's nuts. Warren Beatty thinks he's admired because he was jumping on everybody he could get his hands on. But he's crazy. It's not just a gay thing, it's a sex thing. I would never discuss my private life in any detail with anybody. These guys who sashay around like that are just as pathetic as the guy who's 55 years old with the gold chain sitting in the Cheetah Club checking out the 25-year-old babes. So shut up about it. Everyone has to make their own individual decisions about their sexuality. That's part of being an adult. You should be responsible. You shouldn't hurt anybody, and you shouldn't manipulate or use anybody. But keep quiet. It's between you and your partner. I'm stunned when people go on about their personal lives in People magazine. I know John Tesh. We were both reporters at Channel 2 in New York. In People magazine, he says, I didn't have sex with my wife until we were married. I said, what the hell are you talking about? It diminished it. Why are you doing it? For a week's worth of publicity? It makes me queasy. Playboy, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson blamed gays along with the ACLU and other liberals for September 11th. O'Reilly, stupid. I had Falwell on, slapped him around for it. I said, your job on earth is to convince people to see things the way you do. You just shot that all to hell, and pardon the pun. People are not going to forget this. People will put you in a category where your enemies want you to be. He's discredited by giving his enemies that ammo. It hurt, whatever mission he is on. Robertson is all right, but Falwell believes this stuff. He believes there's a vindictive God. He believes that the deity is teed off. What are you going to do? So anyways, a couple of things here. First of all is that he's kind of touches on a point that I made about a similar point that I made the other day in a monologue, that the gay, let's see where it is. Most Americans are never going to embrace their lifestyle. At the same time, Americans don't want to see anything bad happen to gay people. Dykes on bikes, take a hike. I mean, a lot of this is, I think, too, is an assault. It's not just so much an assault, gay activism on heterosexuals, but as an assault on privacy. Because, again, the central issue is property and property rights in the battle between right and left. The right respects property and acknowledges property and property rights, and the left does not, or does not want to. Wants a part of its paradise is that all property would be jointly owned. There would be no private property. But they know that there's a link between private property and privacy and the expectation of privacy. And their tack here is to go after the expectation of privacy by the average individual. And that if they can encourage and get the average individual to most of the time abandon their expectations of privacy, then they can at some point then say, gee, folks, what do you need private property for since you have no privacy anyhow? Okay. So, again, he's approaching that with the shut up about it situation. Nobody wants to know what it is that you're doing in your bedroom. And that's quite right. But shut up about it, not just because nobody wants to know, but maintain your privacy. What it is that goes on in your life is, it resists the notion, as the left likes to do, is come out and say, let it all hang out. That used to be the phrase in the 60s. And basically it means that you talk with anybody about anything. You might talk with a complete stranger about your sex life. You might talk with them about, like he was saying about John Tesh, saying, gee, I didn't have sex with my wife until we were married. None of my business whether you did or you didn't. The other thing that I wanted to bring up with this is the, as far as sex is concerned, that he would have made a more powerful point here, I think, if he had brought Christianity into this. The other thing that was one of the things I see in this interview is that he and Rush Limbaugh and not so much Sean Hannity, but others, Glenn Beck's better at it now than he used to be, but is the lack of Christianity. Are these folks Christian? Is Bill O'Reilly a Christian? If he's a Christian, then he needs to act like it. He's got to quit pretending he's neutral on the subject of religion, as though he's some kind of a neutral third party in this. You're either an atheist or a theist, one of the two. And if you're theistic, then where do you fall? Are you Christian? Are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Where are you on that in the religious spectrum, so to speak? And act like it when you're talking about the issues of, say, gay and straight and or promiscuity, especially. Then again, you can bring some more force to your argument by introducing, if you're a Christian principles, the things that you were reading in the Bible and that we get taught in church about promiscuity. But that was actually the argument, or the thing I was going to say, is the whole point, as I'd said in my monologue the other day, about gay and straight, is that there's a lot of gay people who say, why do white people or straight people hate us? And then there is those that say, why is it that, I can't remember the other part of it, but as far as gay is concerned, it isn't that it being gay, it's about promiscuity. Oh, the issue is abortion and birth control. Why is it that the right is always after abortion and birth control? Promiscuity, in a word. I mean, that's basically what abortion on demand is all about. So is birth control. The ability, you can go out and be as promiscuous as you want to without having to suffer the consequences. And it is promiscuity that's at issue here. It is promiscuity that is hated. And he was right, Bill O'Reilly was, when he said that any man, heterosexual man that's out making these conquests of women and bragging about it is hated and shunned just as much as any gay man that's promiscuous would be, because the issue is promiscuity. You're not supposed to be out slinging your seeds all over the place. You're supposed to find a person that you can fall in love with, get married to, raise a family, etc. It's not only Christian. It's a way of being a good member of the community. It's social. So that's another reason why, where another contradiction for the left. The left loves sociability. There's no problem that cannot be solved without an ounce of sociability. Just socialize the problem away. And so if that's the case, then they should be supporting the family, nuclear or otherwise. But they very frequently are acting as enemies of the family. So let me see if what else there was here. Oh, and on about Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson blamed gays along with the ACLU and other liberals for September 11th. Now, at first I was going to say that, because again, he went ahead and responded without challenging that. I would have been inclined to say no, they didn't, until Playboy produces proof. What proof do you have that they did any such thing? And then you can go ahead and pick up the discussion from there and say, okay, so they do, now what? Because again, this is one of their tricks where they didn't ask a question. He makes a statement. Okay, so and another way of putting it to them, to a lefty, when they're doing this, is saying, well, is that a question or a statement? Okay, they got to ask a question. And then he went ahead and answered that he had Falwell on his show and slapped him around for it. So he'd already acknowledged this. But just as a matter of practice, Bill O'Reilly should have called them on it and said, hey, is this a question or a statement? And get them to phrase it in the form of a question, and don't take their word for it. Get them to back up their assertions, because you take their word for it on this particular issue, and then you start going down a slippery slope. Okay, where you've already set a precedent. You've taken their word for it on this particular issue. Now you get to take their word for it on something else, something that's a lot more dubious than this particular assertion. So when I come back, another Playboy interview, 1964, with Ayn Rand. And thank you very much. And so it's Ayn Rand to the rescue. And so they're a little bit... Again, it's interesting, too, to read when you're reading these interviews, and you see that the Playboy is pulling some stunts, and they do a little bit with Ayn Rand. They behave themselves for the most part. But when they pull these little stunts, and you can sense from the response of her, and then in an interview I read with Rush Limbaugh on Playboy, they get upset, they get kind of testy, because you can sense that they know something's wrong, but they haven't put their finger on exactly what it is. And if they had, they would be able to correct the situation one way or another. So, in any case, so they're going right now in Playboy. The interview is at a point where they're basically getting her to talk about her quote unquote philosophy and describe what her opinions are on various domestic and foreign political issues. And here we're in foreign policy. So, Playboy, would you actively advocate the United States invade Cuba or the Soviet Union? Rand, not at present. I don't think it's necessary. I would advocate that which The Soviet Union fears above all else economic boycott. I would advocate a blockade of Cuba and an economic boycott of Soviet Russia, and you would see both those regimes collapse without the loss of a single American life. Playboy, would you favor U.S. withdrawal from the United Nations? Rand, yes, I do not sanction the grotesque pretense of an organization allegedly devoted to world peace and human rights, which includes Soviet Russia, the worst aggressor and bloodiest butcher in history, as one of its members. The notion of protecting rights, with Soviet Russia among the protectors, is an insult to the concept of rights and to the intelligence of any man who's asked to endorse or sanction such an organization. I do not believe that an individual should cooperate with criminals, and, for all the same reasons, I do not believe that free countries should cooperate with dictatorships. And real quickly, the correct answer to that question is would you advocate getting out of the United Nations, is that it would depend on you'd have to answer the question, why was the UN created? Two questions. Why was the UN created? And number two, is the UN living up to its charter? Okay. And if it isn't, then the third question comes up, which is, can it be redeemed? Can it be fixed or salvaged? And if the answer to that question is no, then and only then would I say it's time to get out of the United Nations. Because again, you make the presumption for the status quo. The United Nations is here, and I'm not going to say that we should scrap the United Nations simply because I don't like it, or in this particular case, what Ayn Rand is saying, well, I have a personal philosophy, and the United Nations does not comport with and doesn't jive with my philosophy, so therefore it's got to go. No, the United Nations was created. It was created for a specific reason, and assuming that it is fulfilling its mission, the reason that it was created, then it should be supported. If it is not, and it cannot be fixed, then we need to either alter it, radically alter it, come up with some kind of a new idea, like we changed from League of Nations to United Nations, or abolish it in its entirety and go back to the way things were prior to the United Nations. So, and I would argue at this particular point that one of the reasons for the United Nations was to get rid of world wars, because it was formed after World War II. League of Nations, I think, was formed after World War I. But United Nations was formed after World War II, and the whole idea was that it could be a body where nations can bring their grievances and their issues and get them settled without having to resort to combat. And it hasn't worked. There haven't been any declared wars, to the best of my knowledge, up until now, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been wars. There was a war in Iraq. There was war in Afghanistan. There's other countries that are involved in warring activities or have been involved in warring activities. We had, right after World War II, within 5 years, we had what was called a police action. But really what it was a war, and that was on Korea. Right after that, right after you got the truce with the North Koreans, then we had started up with the Vietnam War, even though neither one of those were called wars. One was police action, and I forget how they referred to the Vietnam War, but those were both wars. And then we were involved also in Grenada. Then there's other wars where the Soviet Union was invaded Eastern Europe to put down uprisings in Hungary and other countries, and that where the Soviet Union acted as a sort of like a puppet master, getting Cubans and other people to do their dirty work and get involved in various types of revolutionary wars or civil wars, particularly on the African continent. So I'd say up until now, the UN has failed in its mission to prevent wars. I don't know that it will ever be able to live up to its charter, because the UN as a body has no authority. It really has no authority. In the United States, when you look at the United States, the United Nations, I guess, is supposed to be a kind of a copy of the United States. The United States, there are issues that belong to the federal government. There's issues that belong to the states. States get to decide most things on their own, but there's the federal government there to provide for, say, the common defense. The states have their own national guards, but the national defense is handled by the federal government. Federal government has authority, and so the United Nations has no authority. It doesn't tax. It's not providing any taxes. All the money that it's getting is from voluntary contributions. Members can contribute or not contribute as they see fit. There's no enforcement arm to make sure that people are paying into the system. There's, again, any other types of law enforcement going on with the United Nations, because theoretically the idea would be, if we have an issue with another country, let's say Afghanistan, we go to Afghanistan, say, you need to give us Osama bin Laden, and if Afghanistan says, go pound sand, then theoretically we would go to the United Nations and say, hey, the United Nations, we have a grievance with Afghanistan. You need to force Afghanistan, and with military might, if necessary, to get Osama bin Laden returned to us, or returned to the United Nations to stand trial for the crimes that he's committed against the United States. And then the United Nations would, perhaps there'd be a debate or whatever, but assuming the United Nations agreed with the United States that Afghanistan was in the wrong, the United Nations would take action. They would send troops, etc., to do whatever was necessary to get Osama bin Laden and bring him to justice. But the United Nations doesn't have that power. It doesn't look like the United Nations will ever have that kind of power. And so because of that, I'm inclined, although I'm still keeping a little bit of an open mind about it, but at this point I'm inclined to say, scrap the United Nations. I don't see any type of world body at this particular point that's going to be able to fulfill the role that was given to the United Nations, and that is to prevent wars. It's just not going to happen. So you have to do it with treaties. So I think we should scrap the United Nations and go back to doing engaging in treaties with various other countries, defense treaties and whatnot. So, but again, on principle, not on pragmatic issues. So let's see. Back to the interview. Would you favor? Oh yes, that's right. I've already seen that. Let's see. Would you advocate severing diplomatic relations with Russia? Yes. How do you feel about the test ban treaty which was recently signed? Now it's interesting is she says yes and they don't follow up on that question. But I wouldn't. Again, not unless there's a good reason to do it. What is the reasons that we're having diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union at that time, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and have they done something that's so grotesque that it requires, because severing diplomatic ties is one step before going to war. Very often countries that are going to go to war with each other will sever diplomatic ties as the last step before mobilizing their forces and fighting each other. So when she's advocating that you sever diplomatic relations, she's basically advocating we go to war with Russia. But I think in where is it? Let me see. Oh, she said, let's see. Would you actively advocate the United States invade Cuba or the Soviet Union? No. If you're not going to advocate that we go to war with Soviet Union or Cuba, then why would you advocate withdrawing diplomatic service or diplomatic relations? That's the word I was looking for. Why would you do that? Because again, that's usually the last step before you go to war. And if you don't want to go to war and you don't think it's necessary, then you don't sever diplomatic relations. We leave things the way they are. Again, we make the presumption that it's fine the way it is unless there's an obvious case for change. And I don't see an obvious case for change at that particular time. Again, it's back in 1964 but there was no obvious case for change at that time for breaking off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. How do you feel about the test ban treaty which was recently signed? Rand, I agree with Barry Goldwater's speech on this subject on the Senate floor. The best military authorities and, above all, the best scientific authority, Dr. Teller, the author of the hydrogen bomb, have stated that this treaty is not merely meaningless, but positively dangerous to America's defense. Playboy, if Senator Goldwater is nominated as the Republican presidential candidate this July, would you vote for him? Rand, at present, yes. When I say at present, I mean the date when this interview is being recorded. I disagree. Let me see. Here we go. I disagree with him on many things, but I do agree predominantly with his foreign policy. Of any candidates available today, I regard Barry Goldwater as the best. I would vote for him if he offers us a plausible or at least semi-consistent platform. So, and then they go on and ask him, what about Richard Nixon? They did go ahead and ask about President Johnson. Let me see. Correction. Okay, so that's the only one that they ask about. They really assume that, and she doesn't catch this, that they assume that basically what she is like a conservative in disguise. That objectivism is really just an offshoot or a branch of conservatism. And it is no such thing. Objectivism is idealistic. Conservatism is realistic. So, but anyways, that's we know that they're asking this or thinking in this direction because they ask about Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon, but only about President Johnson. They don't ask about McGovern or anybody else what her opinions are about any other presidential candidates. She is, by the way, says that she's opposed to Richard Nixon. No particular opinion about President Johnson. Playboy, you're a declared anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-liberal, yet you reject the notion that you are a conservative. In fact, you've reserved some of your angriest criticism for conservatives. Where do you stand politically? Fair question. Rand, correction. I never describe my positions in terms of negatives. I am an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism, of individual rights. There are no others. Of individual freedom. It is on this ground that I oppose any doctrine which proposes the sacrifice of the individual to the collective, such as communism, socialism, the welfare state, fascism, Nazism, and modern liberalism. I oppose the conservatives on the same ground. The conservatives are advocates of a mixed economy and of a welfare state. The difference from the liberals is only one of degree and not principle. So again, I would say that she's got it well, and she's talking about when she says conservatives, not true conservatives, but conservatives that are in a lot of cases looking for the very same things that the socialists are looking for, and that is an ideal world, a perfect state, usually a perfect state with a strong religious influence in it, and that if we have a strong religious influence in public life, that will have a tendency to create a perfect world. Excuse me. In other words, it is idealistic. A lot of the conservatives today, and at that particular time, 1964, were not conservative at all. They did not make the presumption of the status quo. They were as much looking for an ideal state, i.e., a perfect, a utopia, as were the socialists. They only differed in kind, as she was saying about the difference between conservatives and socialists. Now, she is so, let's see, here we go. Conservatives advocates of a mixed economy and a welfare state. Differences, the liberals is only one of degree and not of principle. And she is true, but the thing she misses is that her philosophy is equally idealistic to the way that ersatz conservatives think and act and look for. The ersatz conservatives are looking for a perfect state. So is objectivism. Ersatz conservatives want a perfect conservative state with a strong religious influence. She wants a strong or an idealistic objective state with no religious influence, because she's an atheist. And socialists want the ideal socialist state. And libertarians want the ideal state in terms of liberty, perfect objectivism, perfectly conservative or perfect religious state. But true conservative is about making the presumption for the status quo and changing only when change is necessary. With all the others, including Ayn Rand, the presumption is made for change. All of them, whether you're an ersatz conservative or you're an objectivist, get up in the morning and look around and say, what's wrong with the country? What's wrong with this country? Where does it need to be changed? And the socialists do the same thing. So they all fight amongst themselves not about whether or not to change, but what kind of change is necessary. That when all is said and done, what is this country supposed to look like? I say, as a true conservative, it looks pretty damn good from where I'm sitting. And it doesn't need any changes except in cases where the changes are obvious. Conflicts of interest. That's one of the ways, if you want to know what is what are the obvious cases for change, look for conflicts of interest. Public employee unions are an inherent conflict of interest. Having medical boards that are licensing doctors and that are staffed, these medical boards are run by doctors, is a conflict of interest. They're not regulating anything then. They are simply making sure that they take care of their own. Lawyers are the same way. The law bars in every state are full of lawyers. Okay, and a lot of people say, well, what do you expect? Well, what about the oil companies? Why is it that we have a Public Utilities Commission in California, and they regulate the oil industry? Everybody's a utility. And why not have them full of the CEOs, this Public Utilities Commission, of the utilities, Pacific Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison, Southern California Gas, etc. Why not do that? Because instantly people would recognize that's a ridiculous conflict of interest. We can't have that. Okay, because part of the point of having a Public Utilities Commission is to regulate prices. Because if you put the fox in charge of the hen house, the fox is always going to do what's in his own best interest, right? So the government says, the political parties say, put us in charge, we'll make sure that doesn't happen. So the governor appoints people to this Public Utilities Commission that may, you assume, have some knowledge about utilities and whatnot and the issues surrounding utilities, but are not on the board of directors or otherwise employees of the utilities they're supposed to regulate. And that's the way it should be. It should be that way with doctors, should be that way with lawyers, and it should be that way with public employees. Public employees should be civil servants, not union members. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill, and I thank you for listening, and have a great day.